Welcome to the Learn True Health podcast. I'm your host, Ashley James. This is episode 364. We have a very interesting guest on for today's show. David Bloom, I'm so excited to finally have you on the show. I've been a really big fan of Green Home Solutions, which has created you've created this revolutionary technique for removing mold that is both non-toxic and permanent. And it's something that no other company has. I have personally experienced the benefits of what you've created. I had black mold in our bathroom and it was making me sick. I didn't even know it was making me sick, but it basically shot my immune system and I was catching everything. And then I finally used your services and it removed the mold and I stopped catching all the germs. And I thought, this is amazing. I spent probably a year just catching every single cold and flu and just feeling like my immune system had hit rock bottom. And it was because of the mold in our house that I was being exposed to every time I went into our bathroom, which was right off our bedroom. So I was basically breathing in these mold spores all the time. And other companies will use harsh chemicals. They won't actually get rid of 100% rid of the mold. And I'm really looking forward to you teaching us today more about how to create indoor air quality, what to look for, and the science behind this technology that you've developed. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Ashley. It's a privilege to be on with you. You've done some great work. I've listened to several of your podcasts. Just to give you an idea of how this all got started, this was late 90s, early 2000s. I had just completed finishing my basement, turning it into living space. And we had a sewage backup or a blockage, and the plumber came out. We have a septic system, and he was running a snake from the tank back towards the house to clear the blockage. What I forgot was above the ceiling in that newly finished basement space was a standpipe for a water softener. So every time the plumber is pushing this snake, there's effluent coming over that pipe into my basement, which had just been completed into living space. So I sort of freaked out. I called my local DEP and they said, get rid of everything, get somebody in there. You can't salvage it. Called environmental protection. I had the same issue. But I remembered meeting a gentleman in Atlanta airport who had created a particular product that was rather unique. Back at that time, I live in Connecticut, in the Northeast, and most homes, or a lot of the homes up here, are heated using heating oil. And the oil tanks had historically always been buried in the ground. They found that around that time that most of these tanks started leaking. And if you had a tank in the ground, you couldn't sell your house. You would have to remove it first. And if you removed it and they found any evidence of leakage, then that was considered hazardous waste that had to be hauled away. So he had come up with a combination of microbes that would be injected into the ground prior to the tanks being dug up, a few days ahead of time. And these microbes would actually digest the oil in the ground. And then when you dig the tank up, there's no hazardous waste left. It was brilliant. So I had his card, I got a hold of him, and I said, Stephen, would this stuff work for what I'm doing? He said, I have no idea, but why don't you try it? So we did. So we dried the space out ourselves. I mean, I knew what I was doing. I do most of my own work. We use this product as a spray. We use it in carpet shampooers. We use it as a wipe down. We use it in everything. Now, it wasn't a big mess. They came in a corner, maybe a 6x6 area. But it was carpeted space. They told us we'd have to get rid of all that, get rid of the drywall, everything. Bottom line was, we spent a couple of days playing around with this. I had somebody come in and test my house, and there was no evidence of mold. There was no evidence of bacteria. That actually stayed that way. The only thing we got rid of, there was a wood bookcase that had a particle board core. So that swelled up a little bit. I got rid of that. Everything else stayed in there until about 2 years ago when we finally redid the space over. And I test my house regularly, usually about every 6 months. never have had an issue. So we got together, Steve and I got together, and we formed a company, and we started looking at other alternatives. So we worked on this particular product for mold remediation specifically, because it seemed at the time a very good industry to get into. And we expanded it off of that with other cleaning products. We have odor neutralization technologies we developed. We do a biogas desulfurization for anaerobic digesters, which is to clean the gas up so it can be burned in a generator from plants, or using a fuel cell. But that's essentially, so what happens, I went back to school at roughly 50 years old for microbiology because I figured I had to know what I was talking about. And everything took off from there. I come from a family of scientists. I actually took a wrong turn when I went to college and thought that law looked pretty good. My uncle was a very well-known research chemist in the Boston area, and I used to work for him in the summers. As a matter of fact, I had a better chemistry set in my house when I was a teenager than my high school had. And it just thrilled me to death to get back into the sciences. My daughter is finishing up her PhD in neuroscience. I mean, we're a science type of family. And we love what we do because we're helping people. You know, we're not breaking things down. We're just helping people get healthy the best way we can. So it took us a couple of years to get the formula perfected, and it needed to get through an EPA registration, which is not an easy process. You have to prove your efficacy, you have to prove the safety. So it really comes down to having a registered product means that the EPA has looked at our data, which is generated from third-party laboratories, and it matches what we say it does. So it does what we say it does. It's as safe as we say it is. And that's a big deal. In the mold remediation industry, there's a lot of cowboys out there. We call them spray and pray. And they go into somebody's house with God knows what. I mean, they're going to tell you, oh, it's all natural, it's safe, everything's fine. But if it's not EPA registered, there's no way of verifying that. And you just really don't know what you're getting. And unfortunately, it's given the industry, a pretty bad rap. So with Green Home, I got involved with them 2015. They have an exclusive on most of the products that I make now. We have a couple things we do for industry, but most of the products we make. And I have been responsible for training their remediators. They all have to get accredited by the American Council for Accredited Certification, whose own programs are accredited by the Council of Engineering and Scientific Specialty Brands, which is the only one like it. There's a lot of people that have letters after their name in the mold industry, but usually it's a pay to play. You pay them a fee, you answer some questions, and you get a certification.
Mm-hmm.
ACAC does not offer any kind of training. All they do is they do proctored exams. So it's really a great way to do it. And it puts us ahead of a lot of the other people that are out there and much more reputable. But we're actually getting into a lot more things than just mold. In fact, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the two most common indoor pollutants are VOCs and particulates. People don't realize it. There was an article recently in one of the journals where they analyzed the air in a home after they had cooked a roast in their oven. It was a gas oven. I think that would probably make a little bit of a difference. The air quality was equal to New Delhi, India, which is about the 6th most polluted air in the world. All from cooking that roast.
Yeah, I believe that. I had a doctor on who wrote the book Dirty Genes, and his whole thing is teaching people how to help their body through epigenetics, because when we're exposed to different chemicals, it can actually trigger genes to turn on and off, basically genes to be suppressed or express themselves. And when we are cooking with gas, without, when we're breathing in and we don't have the hood on to suck all the byproduct, all the waste of burning gas away from us, it can change our genetics because there are chemicals like formaldehyde in the gas that comes to our stove. And so people often will turn the oven on and then not think to turn the hood on, and their whole house is being filled with formaldehyde.
Yes, now electric stoves still have the issue from with the particulates from the cooking process itself, but
Mm-hmm.
not obviously not from the gas. And while we're talking about gas, one of the other major pollutants are the pilot lights that are on gas fireplaces. A lot of people still have pilot lights instead of electronic ignition. Those are very inefficient the way they burn, and that's something that's not used very often. When it's on, it gets complete combustion. You don't get the same particulate matter. But when it's not operating and just the pilot light is on, then you're putting particulates in. And along those same lines, next one that everybody should be avoiding is burning candles. Candles are atrocious for putting particulates into the air, especially paraffin candles.
Mm-hmm.
Soy-based candles are better. And if you had to burn a candle and you could keep your wick short, under about a half an inch, that's even better. But we did a test when I wish I could share the picture with you right now. I don't have it in front of me, where we hooked up a sort of like a radon fan and a filtration system. We burned a single candle for 20 minutes. This filter was as black could be from that one candle. Nobody realized it. And then you go into somebody's home and they can't understand why they're not feeling well, and they got 25 candles burning everywhere. Not a good idea.
Wow. We have one air filter that we keep running in our bedroom, and I turn it on a few hours before we go into the bedroom to sleep. I turn it on high, and when I walk in there, it is like I'm walking into a fresh forest. The air smells amazing, and not that our house smells bad, but it's just there's something totally different about the quality of the air. It smells clean and fresh, and it feels different when I walk into our bedroom after having turned the air filter on high, and we have it running all night long with us. And I just notice a difference. And I thought that was really interesting that the rest of our house is so different from this one room that has an air filter in it.
I'm guessing you have some charcoal filter in that filter also. Activated charcoal is unbelievably good at absorbing some VOCs and gases. So typically the best combination that I would ever recommend is a HEPA filter with a charcoal pre-filter and activated charcoal. And that will take care of a lot of the pollutants that we would normally see. And HEPA filters down to 0.3 microns. So you're getting most anything that could get down deep in the lung. You're not getting the real tiny stuff, but you're getting a good portion of it.
Mm-hmm. Is Green Home Solutions planning on designing and providing air filters that are that effective?
We're in the middle of looking at that now. There's a lot of them out on the market. There's a big discrepancy between what the lab results on a lot of these filters are versus what you actually get in real life.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Wirecutter, which is a division of New York Times, published an article just recently where they did real life experiences with a bunch of different air filters and made some strong recommendations. There's some really good ones in there. So we're not necessarily looking to reinvent the wheel. We're looking to see if we can find one that does what we want. If we had to, we will. But I think we're going to find a manufactured product that we can recommend based on the design and how it works.
Very
But
cool.
I would recommend that article for your listeners.
Great. I'll make sure that we link it. Is there a particular brand that you have in your home right now that you like?
No.
The jury's still out?
I actually have a commercial unit that I was in the remediation business for a number of years before I decided I didn't want to do the work anymore and just make the stuff that other people use and train people how to do it. So I've got air scrubbers that'll move anywhere between 500 and 2,000 cubic feet of air per minute.
I bet your house smells amazing.
And we've got dogs and cats, so you got to take that into consideration. But I'll run those periodically, for a couple hours, especially if we're not home during the day, I'll let it run. And I have activated carbon pre-filters on those also. So that's what I do use. And then getting back to the VOCs, what a lot of people don't realize, formaldehyde's a big one. Formaldehyde obviously can come from building materials. Particle board has formaldehyde in it for a long time. It still does. New carpet smell is typically formaldehyde. But most of the VOCs that we find when we test homes are actually from personal care and cleaning products.
Mm-hmm.
So the typical house, if you go into and open the cabinet under the sink, is just a cesspool of VOC producing chemicals. And people don't realize that that can be affecting their health in the home. Personal care products. I had a client that I was visiting. She was undergoing chemotherapy. She thought she had mold in the house, and it tested negative for that. So we looked for bacteria. We didn't find anything. So that's when we did the VOC test. And there was sort of a funny smell, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it when I was in there. So when the test results came back, she had two major sources. One was under her sink, and the other was she had a perfume that she would put on when people were coming over. And it was a very light scent. I mean, it had a perfumey type smell, but I didn't really detect it on her. But that was putting a tremendous amount of VOCs into the air. And so here she's sitting getting chemotherapy, but she's making herself ill. So
Mm-hmm.
once we got her to change, and things got better, of course. The other thing that people don't realize is when they store, if you have an attached garage and you store chemicals, you store pesticides, you store gasoline, all of those things can generate gases that then can get sucked into the house. Most homes are under a slight negative pressure. Ideally, we'd have them under positive pressure, but most are under negative pressure, and that comes back to what's called the stack effect, where if you have, assuming you have a basement or a crawl space, air is going to flow from that cooler space below all the way up through to the attic. One of the things that, just on a side note, is if I walked into somebody's attic and I see that they've got mold there, the first thing I would look for is a wet basement or crawl space, because that's typically where it comes from. Second would be lack of
Wow.
ventilation.
So an attic can have mold because the there's like a leak in some other part of the house, but that the
Yeah, a
moisture
moist,
is traveling upwards into the attic.
that's correct. So moisture generated below is always going to go up. And you reach middle pressure, uh, somewhere towards the top of the house, and then you get a little bit of positive pressure in the attic. But I'm sorry, negative pressure. So it is all going in that one flow. It's a very common known issue. Nowadays, they typically try to air seal attics from the rest of the house so that you don't get anything going up. And then if you can condition your house to take care of that moisture, you're fine. But I mean, here in New England, if you have, we typically all have basements here, but if you don't have a dehumidifier in your basement, you're going to have a mold issue. Because in the summertime, it gets very hot and humid. We get a tremendous amount of moisture because that cooler space down below, you get hot air infiltrating into the house. It reaches that cool air, that cool space, and you get moisture. Ventilated crawl spaces are a big issue. Same thing. You have hot, humid air coming in. It hits the cooler surface of the dirt or the floor in the crawl space, and it condenses, and you end up with a moisture problem. In fact, some people put fans in there because they think if they move more air through their crawl space, it makes sense. But the reality is you're really just bringing in more moisture and
Oh.
allowing it to condense.
So
So I
what?
like to see sealed crawl spaces.
Okay, I was gonna say, what's the solution? So the solution is
Yeah,
to seal them.
yeah, that's the best thing you can do is seal it. And then if you don't have combustion appliances in a crawl space, then we would actually recommend sealing the entire thing. You'd probably still put a dehumidifier in there, but you would seal between the crawl space and the living space. And obviously, you're going to seal between the outside and the crawl space itself and the ground. If you do have combustion appliances, you have to be careful because those typically require either a draft for the gas to get up the chimney or plus the air for combustion. So there you have to have some alternative ways of doing it. Modern day furnaces, condensing furnaces, gas units have their own air supply. For other types of units, oil here, they do something where they bring in, we call it a fan in a can, but it's a little fan that turns on when your furnace turns on, so it has enough air for combustion. But yeah, no, sealing them up is one of the best things you could do. Crawl space encapsulation is very, it improves the whole indoor air quality of the house.
Are your Green Home Solutions franchises, So you teach, you're one of the main educators at Green Home Solutions, and you teach these franchisees how to do these things. And I know they go through
Correct.
extensive education with you. Do you teach them how to detect these kind of problems, sort of beyond mold, but looking at what should be, like where the VOCs and particulates are coming from, what should be sealed off? Like, is this something that if one of our listeners called Green Home Solutions and had one of their franchisees, their local person come out to their house, they could inspect this and see if they could find these problems?
Yes. We spend several days just teaching building sciences. So we teach them about how proper construction techniques to manage moisture so that when they go to look at a property, and if it doesn't look like the way it's supposed to look, you know you've got a potential issue there. As far as testing for these, we're just really getting into it. I've been doing it for a while. I've got several franchisees that are perfectly qualified, and we're slowly getting everybody. So originally we'd go in and test for mold. If that came back negative, then we were sort of out of luck because we're not helping anybody. We just told them they don't have a mold issue, they have some other issue. And actually, mold really isn't a problem. Mold is a symptom of a problem.
Mm.
Moisture is the issue. So mold is just a symptom of a moisture problem. So that's why we spend so much time with the building sciences, is because they have to be able to identify where the source of moisture is coming from. And we do that. We use thermal imaging, we use moisture meters, we have boroscopes so we can look inside walls. We have a number of tools available to us that help us do these inspections, but there's really no substitute for your eyes and your nose, actually, of just looking around. So we can test for molds, we'll test for bacteria, we can test for VOCs. Formaldehyde we typically test for separately because it doesn't always show up in a standard VOC test. If there were spray foam insulation, we'll do a different type of aldehyde test. Spray foam, if it isn't put in perfectly, it can off gas, and the half-life is like 50 years. It never goes away.
Oh my gosh. I know so many people who have thought they were really smart to use spray foam for insulation and they do it themselves.
I used to recommend it. I don't any longer, although in some situations it's okay. And if they're doing it themselves and they're using a single part system, that's okay too. But when it's done professionally, there's two separate components to it that get mixed together. And if everything is not perfect, it doesn't cure properly. And then it has the potential to off gas for an extended period of time. But in some areas, you have to do it. We were talking to some people up in Boston that had bought a new condo, and they're renovating it, and they only had about 9 inches of ceiling space, but Boston requires a R60, I think it was, for insulation in the ceiling, in the roof. And the only way you can get that level is with spray foam. So if it's done properly, it's sort of, somebody described it to me as this, somebody smarter than I. He said it's like playing Russian roulette with a revolver that's got 50 chambers. 49 out of 50 times it's going to be fine. But when it's not, it's catastrophic. I did several spray foam insulation remediation projects, or managed them a few years back, and I couldn't do it anymore. I mean, it was just awful. The first one, we literally cut the roof off the people's house.
Oh my
Cut it
gosh.
off where the rafters meet the ceiling joists, took it off with a crane and built them a new roof. Second one I did, they tore the house down because there was no way to fix it. If it's a mild issue, you can bring in more fresh air. I did one there, we put in something that brought in an extra, I think it was several thousand cubic feet per minute of fresh air, conditioned it, and it kept the house at a positive pressure, so it held the gas in the wall. That's why positive pressure is always good. When you end up with negative pressure, you can suck pollutants from places you didn't even know you had. Which brings me to my next point.
Wait, hold on. I want you to come to that point in a sec, but I need to unpack that. My mind is about to explode. So many people have homes that have this spray foam. Maybe they moved into a house and someone else had done the spray foam, and they're sitting here going, "Oh my gosh, I have spray foam in my attic. I have no idea whether my house is positive or negative, whether the draft is coming down from the attic, and I don't know whether it's off gassing." Can we talk a bit about what are the symptoms, or what are the, like, what's the harm in having this spray foam off gas for 50 years to our whole family in our house?
If it's off gassing, and that's a big if. Like I said, 49 out of 50 times it's probably just fine. If it's off gassing, there's usually a little bit of an odor that you detect, but not everybody is sensitive to it. That first house I mentioned where we took the roof off, the two of the people that lived there had no symptoms at all, and one of them it's actually one of their children, couldn't stay there. It was an adult child, but he couldn't stay there. I mean, he just would get headaches, he'd get migraines, he felt awful, and as soon as he
Mm.
left the house, he felt better. So obviously, there was some sort of a correlation there. Now, if somebody wanted to check and see if theirs was cured properly, you could actually cut a little sample out, put it in a mason jar, and set it out in the sun for a little bit. Then open it up and take a big whiff. If it has sort of a sweet, fishy smell, that would be an aldehyde. That one of the gases that's pretty common when
Okay.
it's not right. Um,
Analdehyde.
Aldehyde, like formaldehyde is an aldehyde. There are other aldehydes, glutaldehyde, formaldehyde, but they're aldehydes. Often you have acetic acid, which is like a vinegary kind of, little bit of a vinegar kind of smell. I mean, this is not a scientific test by any way, shape, or form, but it's something simple that somebody could do. To do it properly, you would have to have, they use what are called sorbent tubes and a pump. It runs for about 24 hours. And that then gets analyzed specifically for gases that could be present in spray foam. There's not a lot of places that do that. In fact, I'm only aware of one laboratory that does that kind of analysis, specifically for spray foam. There's a lot of really good labs that can test for various VOCs, but they have a very nice panel of all the different potential gases that could come out of spray foam insulation.
We didn't define VOCs, so for those who don't know what VOCs are, can you just define it and explain why they're harmful?
So VOCs are volatile organic compounds, and they're essentially gases that are given off by various organics through their life cycle, so to speak. Now, a lot of them will off gas fairly quickly and dissipate quite quick. We had new carpet put in, as I mentioned, when I redid my basement living space not long ago, and that stunk. I mean, it was awful. And I wanted to see, I have a way of getting rid of it, but I wanted to see how long it would take to actually dissipate on its own. We weren't using the space. I figured it'd be fine. And it took almost 4 weeks before it completely off-gassed. So it's an off-gassing from a chemical compound. It usually gets more intense when it's heated. So that actually is one of the methods of trying to get rid of VOCs in a house. You could turn your heat up as high as it'll go, let it run that way for 8 or 9 hours, and then ventilate the heck out of it. So
Mm-hmm.
the idea is to get as much of that gas as you can into the air and then get it out of the house.
And don't stay in the house while it's happening.
No, I mean, because you're going to put more of it into the air. The other thing that people forget about is just open your windows. I mean, this is going to sound silly, but I tell people this all the time. Dilution can be the solution for pollution.
Mm-hmm.
Just diluting that air so the concentration now is lower makes a big difference. And as houses get built tighter and tighter and tighter, because for energy efficiency, if there's not enough fresh air makeup, your carbon dioxide levels go way up because we're, as humans, are exhaling a lot of carbon dioxide. The moisture levels go up because we as humans emit a lot of moisture. And it's got nowhere to go, which is also why we see more instances of mold growth nowadays than we did in the older homes. My first
Right.
house I bought was built in, what was it, 1865, I think. It leaked like a sieve, but I never had a mold issue because it could breathe. It had the ability to dry if it got wet. It could dry to the exterior, it could dry to the interior. Now, when we build these things so tight, there's no ability for them to breathe. So there are units, they're either energy recovery units or heat recovery energy recovery ventilators or heat recovery ventilators, ERVs or HRVs. Those are pretty standard issue today in modern homes. And what they do is they take an equal amount of outdoor air and exit an equal amount of indoor air. So you always have some fresh air coming in. Problem I see is they don't seem to be enough. In a lot of cases, the house is really tight. There's just not enough of it, and it needs to be increased. And there are ways to doing that. But as I mentioned, open your windows and take a deep breath. Now, granted, you're exposed to a lot more mold outside than you are inside normally. But getting that air diluted, especially for any of these other things we were talking about, particulates, VOCs, let's dilute it and make it not such a big deal. Now, getting back to the things that we test for, we can also test for settled allergen. We'll take a dust sample, for example, and have it analyzed for pet dander, dog dander, cat dander, dust mite matter, rodent excrement. There's a lot of things they can look for, and they can actually look for actual particles too. I had an instance where a woman wasn't feeling well in her home, and she said that she's had an abnormal amount of dust lately. And we had the dust analyzed, and it was silica. So I took a drive around, and about a mile away from her home, there was a place that they were demolishing a building, and they were generating a lot of silica dust. And that was carrying into her home, and that's what was causing the issue. So it really becomes sort of it's an investigation. It's a lot of fun, actually, too. And then the other thing, too, is radon. Radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer after cigarettes in this country. People will test for radon when they buy their home and never think of it again. It really should be tested every 3 or 4 years. It's a simple test. It's non-invasive, but that and your water should be tested on a regular basis, especially if you're on a well system.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I want to talk about the radon for a sec. What in the home could generate radon?
Radon is a naturally occurring gas from the ground. It's actually it comes from rocks similar to uranium, actually, but it's naturally occurring. It's much stronger in certain parts of the country. The Northeast has pretty high radon because we have a lot of rock, and that tends to be where it's coming from.
Because the bedrock, right? Because of the Precambrian shield, I think is what it's called. Yeah.
And certain other parts of the country it's not nearly as big of a deal, but certain parts, I know the East Coast is pretty good. Getting down south, you don't see it as much because the soil is much sandier and there's not anywhere near as much rock. But the government, EPA, has a map on their website that shows where the highest instances of radon are. And I would certainly recommend to your listeners that they take a look at that. And if they're in one of the red areas, get it checked if you hadn't done it in a couple of years. Mm-hmm. It's an odorless, colorless gas. You'll never know if you have it.
But it can cause lung cancer.
It can cause lung cancer.
Very interesting. Yeah, because we're always thinking that these things in our home might be from, like you said, carpet or mattress off-gassing, but we never think, or mold, but we don't think that something totally natural, coming from the ground would be harmful, right? So to remember to test radon, and it can shift. So when you first buy your home, there might be no radon. There might be radon isn't present, but 5 years in the future, it could start happening, like something what shifts in the earth, and it just starts off gassing.
A construction project can do it. I personally had an incident. This isn't with radon, but with my well. Our well water has always been perfect. Mm-hmm. And they were building, I live in a fairly rural area. They were building a new house, I don't know, maybe a quarter mile from me on my street. And all of a sudden, I started getting iron in my water, mm-hmm. and large amounts of water. And it came from the construction that they were doing. And when they had a blast, because again, we have so much bedrock, they had a blast to actually get their well drilled. It disturbed the aquifer. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, it started with a relatively high iron content. We had to put a fairly sophisticated filter system on to take care of that.
I just had the exact same thing happen. We're on a well, and we've been living here 5 years. The water has been perfect. We were joking about bottling it and in glass bottles and selling it, to Europe or something. I mean, it's just like the best water. We had friends come from all around to bottle our water and take it home with them. And all of a sudden, our water became murky, tastes like heavy metals, like it tastes like not just iron, but tastes like just very metallic. And it had an odor to it out of nowhere. Just one day it's fine, next day it's not. And we had to, obviously we got a water filter, but we're waiting back from the lab right now. They said it will take like 10 days because they're testing all these things. And it feels like it's taking a million years to get these results back because I want to know what's going on with our water. Is it even safe to bathe in it? We were like bathing at a friend's house. But yeah, then that made me realize that I hadn't actually had our well water tested since our son was born, because we had it tested to see if the nitrates were high. That's
Right.
one thing, because we had to substitute with some formula, and I didn't want to make the formula with water that's high in nitrogen because nitrates, sorry, because it can cause blue baby syndrome. But for adults too, it makes the our red blood cell not be able to carry oxygen. And so people can feel really lethargic and sort of just down if they're drinking well water that's high in nitrates. And most filters cannot filter out nitrates. I discovered that most filters on the market, you have to get a specific filter that filters nitrates. So really being careful if we have a well, and making sure that we test our water every year is really important. And it kind of just time flew by, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like what are we doing drinking this water that we don't test every year? So yeah, being really careful, testing for radon every few years, testing if you have a well, most people don't, but if you do, getting that water tested. You mentioned that one of the things that your franchisees do with Green Home Solutions is test the home for bacteria. Like why test the home for bacteria? Is the bacteria growing inside the home?
Well, bacteria is growing everywhere. I mean, in fact, there's a book by a guy named Rob Dunn called Never Home Alone, and it's about the microbial biome that you live with all the time. And it's creepy, but no, it exists. I mean, we need them. Most of the bacteria is healthy and it's fine, but we just don't want bad bacteria. So when I was back doing remediation before I got involved with Green Home, we found numerous instances where we would test for mold, it would come back negative. So we would test for airborne bacteria levels. And if those were elevated, we would take care of it in the same way, because the product works equally as well on bacteria as it does on mold. Bacteria is actually much easier to get rid of. Bacteria have just a single cell wall, whereas mold spores can have 2 or 3 membranes you have to get through before you can get to the nucleus. And I'll get into that in a minute. But so airborne bacteria levels, which a lot of people take swabs on a surface, it's going to have bacteria in it. I mean, it should in most cases. But airborne bacteria levels, if they're elevated, sometimes could be an issue. It's not as common. I don't do airborne bacteria very often, but it is a test that's available. Now, for surface, one of the things that we do, which is really, we're using something that's out of the food service industry, which is called an ATP test. And this is really used to determine cleanliness. ATP is a particular enzyme that's present in all organic matter. So this is an instant test. We do it with a meter and a swab, so that I can take samples in numerous locations around the house. And if the levels are elevated, I don't necessarily know that's bacteria, but it does indicate a general level of uncleanliness, I guess, which could easily be bacteria, because it could be peanut butter for all I know, but there's something. So it's just an overall level of cleanliness. But if you have a clean home, you typically don't have much of these other issues, with bacteria that you don't want in particular.
So when you met Steve at the Atlanta airport, I think that's such divine intervention to have the two of you meet with your, love of science and that problem that you had in your home. It kind of Do you look back at your life and see how it's sort of like all the stars aligned? You had to have that bad thing happen to you in your home in order to be intrigued. So when you met Steve, you had this problem to solve, and then that led you to want to solve this problem for other people.
Yes. Uh, it was probably, I mean, that event was life changing for me. I switched careers. I was a small business owner for a number of years. I completely switched careers in the middle of my life, and I just fell in love with the fact that I was able to help people. I liked the fact that Green Home being a relatively new company, um, a lot of the people I work with are half my age, which is terrific. I love it. And I love sort of getting the next generation involved in this same kind of work. So no,
Hmm.
I've never been happier, and I mean I can't imagine why I would ever want to retire. I mean I love what I'm doing.
Yes, that's exactly, you're doing what you should do when you don't want to retire. Like when I interviewed Dr. Esselstyn, he's in his 80s. I think he's something like 87, and he still is a active cardiologist at the Cleveland Clinic, and he still takes phone calls. If you call him up, he'll answer the phone. He talks to people all day long for free. He's amazing. But he's the kind of person that he's going to be like 110 years old and he's still going to be a cardiologist, like helping people. So when you find your life's calling, you find your purpose in life, you do it for free, when you absolutely love what you do, and especially when it comes to helping people. So David, I know what you do is really, you're passionate about it, but you're also really helping people. You're helping the business owners, those who choose to be like a franchisee of Green Home Solutions. You're helping them to help other people, and then ultimately you're helping all these homeowners through what you're doing as the chief science officer at Green Home Solutions. When you met Steve and he talked about this enzyme that he created to break down the oil, how did you figure out that it could also be effective at basically demolishing mold? Can you take us back to that moment, that conversation you were first having with Steve? Was it a light bulb moment? Like, how did you come to that conclusion?
No, it was actually by chance because I had met him and learned a little bit about what he was doing in the oil with the oil stuff and the fact. Then I started, so I had enzymes on the brain to start with. And when you look at what enzymes do, enzymes can either break things apart or they can build things up. We have about 3,000 different kinds of enzymes in our bodies. We would not be alive without them because what they do is they speed up the reactions that are required to keep us alive. And the reactions wouldn't occur fast enough without them. They're in our RNA and DNA. There's enzymes in there. They're in almost everything. So when he was talking about using the enzymes to essentially digest the oil molecules, I said, well, why couldn't we do this? And then of course when I tried it, we had no idea whether it would do anything or not. It did actually work pretty good. Not as good as what we have now, but it did work pretty good. Um, but the concept of breaking something down by using itself, so to speak. So the enzymes that are present in our mold product are actually come from molds. They're harvested from other molds. So molds have a very, very strong protective mechanism. And they have these things, we call them acceptors, that open and close. They're like channels that allow material to get in. That's how they get their food, their energy, their moisture. When they're when they come in contact with something that's foreign, they typically, sort of like close up and don't allow anything to enter. When we attack a mold spore with our product, it's like a homecoming, and they welcome it with open arms. So it actually gets in and destroys the mold spore from the inside out.
That's so cool.
And then the enzymes themselves are specific types to break down various parts of a mold spore. So there would be one type that would go after the membranes, one type that goes after the fatty lipid layer between the membranes. The nucleus is typically a protein. So we use a protease, which breaks the bond. Proteins are just strings of amino acids held together by a peptide bond. By breaking, the protease breaks that bond. It actually digests it. So all that's left is amino acids. And typically, when most people have a reaction to mold, your typical reaction, I'm not talking about people that have very serious diseases, but just your typical sort of sinus type reactions, that's a reaction to the proteins. So by breaking down the proteins to amino acids, there's no protein, there's no allergen. So mold is essentially a histamine. So that's why if you get a cold or a stuffy head, you're going to take an antihistamine to try and get rid of that. So it's the same, mold has the same symptoms as a histamine. That's the trigger. So by breaking down the components so that you don't have an allergen left, it makes all the difference in the world.
Does inhaling mold or the mold spores increase histamine in the body?
You know, I don't know, to be honest. I'm not a medical professional. That would be a question. I'm sure I could find out. Nobody asked me that question before, to be honest with you.
Well, if it itself is a histamine, is it as we're inhaling it, is it the same as our own histamines? I'm just wondering, because I know our bodies react to it. I mean, it is like someone breathing in pollen and their histamine levels go up, or someone eating a food they're allergic to and their histamine levels go up, or even under stress, our histamine levels go up.
I would assume it's the same kind of trigger.
Mm-hmm. This is so fascinating. So this one thing that was explained to me, I had a health coach on the show, and she's the one that introduced me to you guys, and it was life-changing for her to find your company. She bought a home with her family in California, and for 6 months she could not live in their new home. She had to live in a tent in the backyard because she was sick every time she went into their new home because it had mold. And they finally found your company, and so they went in and they, sprayed everything. And she said it was like a miracle. She was able to live in the home after that. So she's had a lot of her clients use the Green Home Solutions services very successfully. And when I interviewed her, she told me about it because I was telling her about how my immune system was shot, and I didn't know why, because I eat super healthy, I have a really healthy lifestyle, like what's going on. And something that you wrote to me, you said in something you wrote to me, that basically health requires 3 things. It requires that we take into account lifestyle, genetics, and our environment. And she pointed out that my environment probably had mold in it and told me about you guys. And how she explained how it works is she basically said a lot of companies will say they're mold remediators, and they go ahead and just use something like bleach, which just kills the mold but does not get rid of the mold spores. And so mold, even though it's quote unquote dead, is actually now more toxic because now it releases these mold spores and it can still harm your body. Is that an accurate description of what other, like if I went to Home Depot and bought some kind of like all natural mold remediation or whatever, or someone uses bleach, which is so common. I've heard landlords use bleach all the time. The difference between those chemicals and the enzymes that you use, can you explain the difference?
Sure. It's actually pretty simple. Most of those products, a lot of them are oxidizers, and oxidizers can work a couple of different ways. An oxidizer can literally shake a molecule to break it apart, and then essentially the guts leak out, it's dead. But you still have the residual. Others are DNA disruptors. They actually don't kill the spore. They just make it so it can't reproduce. So you still have the spore left. It's still intact and could still trigger an allergenic reaction, which is the most common response. And then bleach is a really good example of this, actually. If you had mold on a wall in your home, the roots of the mold are into the paper. What you see on the surface is topical. So bleach, let's say it reacts with that mold. It's what we call a stoichiometric reaction. It's a one-on-one reaction, and all the energy in that chemical is consumed instantly. It's used up instantly. So even if it kills the mold on the surface, the byproduct of that reaction is water. And water is now going to feed the roots that are still in the wall. So that's why often when people use bleach, it looks like they got rid of it for a short period of time, but it comes back because they actually fed the roots. Now, enzymes, on the other hand, are catalysts. So a catalyst enables a reaction to occur, but it's not consumed in the reaction. So it will continue working as long as there's something for it to work on. The best analogy I can give you is men's facial hair. So if I were to shave, that's sort of like using the bleach. If I were to have laser hair removal, that's using our product.
Because you're getting the root.
We're getting the root. That's
So
what makes a difference. Now, there is some evidence, and this is, it's not an exact science, but there is some evidence that as mold, when it's killed, or as those reactions are occurring, some molds can give off toxins. They're known as mycotoxins, which can be harmful. The problem is that not all molds do produce mycotoxins, and even the ones that do don't do it all the time. And there's no real easy way to measure for them. A lot of people will test for mycotoxins in their urine, or even their urine typically. But I would challenge that every one of us has evidence of mycotoxins in our urine because it's on our foods. If you were to open your refrigerator door and close it before you had somebody take an air sample for mold, you would dramatically skew those results, even though you have no visible mold in your refrigerator. Trust me, there's mold on your food. So that's that's where it comes from. So it makes it a little bit difficult. Going back to your air filtration, activated carbon is pretty good at working with mycotoxins. So that's why I talk about activated carbon a lot. I mean, you can even buy these bags now that you just sit out and they absorb some odors and things like that. That kind of stuff could be helpful for someone. The other thing that we found when we started working with doctors, and that's where that whole 3-part thing was. It was to try to convince a doctor that, look, if you're looking at genetics, lifestyle, and environment, if we can take the environment out of the picture, that makes, number one, even if it's not the problem, at least we eliminated one leg. And now it makes it easier for you to do your diagnosis. Mm-hmm. We did this, several of the doctors we worked with did discover a correlation between the treatment for Lyme disease and moldy homes. So what they were finding is the normal treatments they would do for Lyme weren't working on a number of their patients. When we got them to look at the environment and we cleaned up the environment, all of a sudden they started responding to their treatment.
Yes. So what kind of things were common? Was there did you find that everyone that had Lyme also had mold in their home, or was there some kind of commonality?
No, the commonality for us was the particular practice that we got that started us on this path, because they had a lot of Lyme patients and they were trying to figure out what could it be? Why are these people not reacting? And the commonality was the fact that they had mold in their homes.
Okay, that's what I meant. So you had all these Lyme patients given to you by this practice, and you went into their homes, and all of them had mold in their homes?
No, not well. All the ones that weren't reacting to the treatment, yes.
Oh, yeah, that's what I meant. So all the Lyme patients who weren't reacting to the treatment, all of them had mold in their homes.
That's correct.
And when the mold was removed, all of them started responding to the treatment?
In all honesty, I can't say that every single one of them did, because I don't know.
Well, you didn't stick around to follow up with the doctor.
I didn't stick around to follow up long enough, but the doctor this particular practice there in Roanoke, Virginia, happens to refer a ton of patients to Green Home. And that has actually spread. So we've made some really strong inroads. Mm-hmm. And that's what made us get into all those additional testing things, because if we're going to look at the environment at home, we decided that, mold is one piece of the puzzle, but look at all these other potentials. Mm-hmm. So the downside is lab fees can add up quickly. So when we go in and look at a home, we want to know what we're looking for. I don't want to just go in and test willy-nilly. I want to make it, an educated, get a hypothesis, and then devise a testing strategy that's going to either prove or disprove that hypothesis. Mm-hmm. So often we'll do a couple of basic tests first to rule out the most obvious. And then it gets a little bit more detailed if that's not the answer. And I have to admit, I mean, there's sometimes when we've been stumped. I have a particular one of Green Home franchisees not far from me has a particular client that is we just can't figure it out. I mean, I've done a fair amount of testing on all kinds of different things. His doctors don't have any clue. And, occasionally there is some syndrome, and for the life of me, I can't remember it, where your brain actually gets wired a little bit differently. And it's not a hypochondriac because the symptoms are real, but they're caused by the brain, not necessarily by an external force. There is an actual name for it. I just can't recall what it was. But we've had numerous times where there's other people out there that do mold remediation in a number of different ways. I mean, the old way was just what we call bash and trash. You go in, you just physically remove everything. Now, we do follow IICRC, the S520 standards. That's the Institute of Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration certification. And they came up with a guideline on basic standards. So they have 5 specific principles that we follow as part of what we do. So to say that we don't remove building materials would be a misnomer. We do. We just try to preserve as much as possible. And because of our method, we're typically able to preserve more, which makes it a more economical project instead of just going in and just ripping everything out and putting it all back together. So there's a lot of that going on there. And I'll tell you, we had one person, client that I got a wonderful letter from just recently where she was in the Atlanta area, and they told her, they found mold in her home, and her doctor told her she had to leave the house and get rid of all her possessions. And she did. She moved into an apartment. She had Green Home test the apartment. It had mold. So then they said, well, we got to get out of here. So they looked at 4 or 5 different other places, and they couldn't, everything, they all had mold. I mean, it's in the South, it's humid, it's hot, there's mold. So when I talked to her, I said, look, why don't you let us see if we can get you back into your home? And, there's a number of things that we can do. And, if it doesn't work, you don't pay me.
Oh, that's nice.
Let's give it a shot. So we did. We went in, we treated it for mold. We also did we have a device that uses a very low level of hydrogen peroxide, but yet gets a 99.9999% kill, which is a 6-log reduction on bacteria. And we did that in a couple of areas that were problematic, just sort of for insurance. And I believe you were aware that we also have this probiotic treatment. We put that back in there. So they moved back into the house, and she said it was like the place was brand new. She said, so the letter I got said that I saved her marriage, I saved her life, I saved her kids' happiness, I saved her dog. I mean, it was just crazy. But we got her back into her own house because all the properties were going to have an issue. Let's just fix the one we've got.
Yeah.
But I hear that happening time and time again. I was meeting with a doctor in Peabody, Mass, who had a client that had just built a $5 million dream home on a lake. And the same thing, whoever her prior doctor was told her, your house is killing you, you got to leave. She got out of the house, went somewhere else, and she didn't get any better. So it wasn't necessarily the home. And that's what we try to avoid. There's a lot of testing that's being done now called ERMI, which is Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. ERMI was developed in the early 2000s to be used as a research tool to see if there was any correlation between water damaged properties in the Detroit area and childhood asthma.
Ooh.
So they came up with this way. It's actually PCR testing, which is they're measuring DNA. So it had a very specific design to it. You took a 6x3 area in the main living room and you vacuumed that with a special attachment for exactly 5 minutes. You repeated the same thing in the main bedroom. And then it gets analyzed for mold DNA. And what they did is they had a list of 36 molds, 26 that were potential water damage indicators, and 10 that were typical environmental molds. And they subtract the environmental molds from the water damage molds, and they come up with this score. What the score shows is sort of a history of that building. That's why they did it on carpeting. Carpet is designed to hide dirt, so it traps stuff deep down,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how they look clean. So it's getting that stuff, but you don't know if it's something, and as I mentioned, mold is a symptom. Moisture is the issue. We don't know if there was a moisture problem in that property 25 years ago or yesterday. So what happens is nowadays there's a lot of people recommending that particular type of testing, and it does serve its purpose. Don't get me wrong, not that I don't like it, but they're making decisions on whether they should remediate or not based on it. And they're not following the test. But most of these are getting advised to now is to take a Swiffer cloth and just go pick up some settled dust around there. Well, that's not how the test was designed. It was never meant to be done that way. So they're not sampling properly. And then they come back with a high score, and they'll spend thousands and thousands of dollars chasing something that doesn't exist because there is no moisture issue. It's really at that point housekeeping, getting rid of all that dust.
So just to elaborate on what you said earlier on, you said the problem, mold is a problem. Mold is dangerous for our health. We should not live in a home with mold. But it's not the root cause. And you're looking, you don't chase symptoms. So if you go to an MD with a headache, they might chase symptoms and prescribe something, right? And instead of ask like deeper questions, right? You go to a naturopath, they're going to go, okay, well, what's going on? Let's find out what the root cause is, because a headache is a symptom. So you're saying mold in a house is a symptom of a problem. Moisture and in looking at whether you need to make the house pressurized, whether you need to ventilate properly, or whether you need to seal off certain areas. But when you solve the root cause, and of course take care of the mold, you solve the root cause, the mold doesn't come back.
Correct.
And so testing, if other companies test incorrectly, they could be testing for a mold problem that no longer exists and then paying thousands of dollars to treat something that's not there.
Correct.
Got it.
So the Inspector General of the EPA came out with a position statement a couple of years ago and said exactly that this was designed solely as a research tool. It was never intended to be used to determine whether a property needed remediation, nor should it be used to determine if remediation was done properly. One of the more interesting things, though, if you look at the numbers, so if I had an individual that was mold sensitive, I would think they'd be, the overall mold exposure is going to be very important. We want to limit that as much as we can. So let's say you had a very small amount of the water damage indicator molds, but you had a ton of the environmental molds. Your overall exposure would be quite high, but your ERMI score is going to be very low. And vice versa is true. So if you had if you really cleaned a place well, so that there's absolutely almost none of the environmental molds, but there's, let's say, a couple of fragments of the other ones, you can have a high ERMI score because there's nothing to subtract from it. So when we see people using ERMI to confirm remediation, typically they've got to wait 30 to 45 days to let that house settle down and equalize with essentially what's outdoors. And then the ERMI score comes down. But instead, they'll spend, again, they sometimes get into that trap of spending thousands of dollars. And it kills me when I see that happen.
Thank you for warning us about that. I know that Green Home Solutions is in a lot of places, but it's not everywhere. So if someone's in an area where Green Home Solutions just isn't there and they have to use a different company, it's really good to know to make sure you don't use a company that uses the ERMI score to test your mold.
Again, don't get me wrong, ERMI does have a place, and it can be a very useful tool, especially if you're looking for a historical idea of what's going on in the property. It just shouldn't be the only thing used to determine if you need remediation, because you could get false positives. And unfortunately, a lot of the medical community has gotten involved. The idea of having a standardized test is brilliant, because the other types of testing that's done for mold, either air sampling or surface sampling, it's not an exact science. Typically we look to compare suspect areas to non-suspect areas. So if you tell me that you feel okay in the bedroom, but you don't feel good in the living room, I'm going to sample both and see what the difference is. If it's not that situation, typically we look at see what the outdoors is, because once you open your windows or your door, you're going to start to equalize whatever you have outside. And what we're looking for, and we're never going to make a house completely mold free. What we're looking for is just to make sure that there's nothing actively growing in the home.
Mm-hmm. Because I was about to ask, you mentioned environmental molds versus the sort of mold, the black mold growing in my bathroom, for example. So environmental molds, maybe someone walks into the house after going for a walk and they don't take their shoes off and they're tracking something through the house, or our groceries come into the house, or our dog walks into the house and the dog tracks in something. So environmental molds are just things that would come from outside, from nature.
Yeah, they're common. Yes. Now, that's not to say none of them. I mean, if you're very sensitive to molds, any kind of mold could bother you, potentially. But these are molds that we would commonly see in our everyday life, and you don't even have to bring it in with you. Just open the door, and you feel that little breeze. Yep, that's all coming inside. So we can't escape it. But we try to keep the houses as clean as can. And make sure that it's not actively growing.
Got it. So environmental mold comes from the outside. It's not growing. It's not taking hold of the wood or the drywall and like replicating itself.
Well, it could if you had a food source, which is complex polysaccharides is really what mold loves, which is like paper, cellulose, and a moisture source, and you need some air. So yeah, it could grow. When you see, often we'll see windows that get condensation on them. You'll see a little bit of black mold all the way around them. That's actually cladosporium. And cladosporium is decaying leaves and grass. It's a very common outdoor mold, and it's probably the most common mold there is. And that you can just wipe off. I mean, it's coming because your windows have condensation on them. We see that down in southern areas, in particularly because a lot of times they have metal window frames. You have hot, humid weather outdoors, so they keep the inside really cold, and that temperature differential causes condensation. Just like if you take a bottle of water outside in the summer and it starts to sweat, that's the same reaction. So then you're getting your typical environmental mold growing on it. So a lot of molds are black, by the way. When people talk about the black mold, they're usually talking about a species of Stachybotrys called Stachybotrys chartum, which happens to be a particularly nasty mold to a lot of people. Which brings me to another thing I just want to mention, why mold testing can be valuable. If I got called into a home and there's some mold growing because a washing machine hose broke 2 weeks ago, and I looked at that with blinders on and got rid of it, I may be doing that client a disservice. If we take samples, for example, and I see that there's Chytomium or Stachybotrys, those are what we call tertiary molds. So you have three classes of mold, essentially: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary molds will show first after a water event, and sometimes as fast as 24 to 48 hours. Penicillium is a good example of a primary mold. Secondary molds typically take 3 or 4 weeks of that moisture exposure before they grow. And then your tertiary molds can take months. So if I looked at this water damage that occurred 2 weeks ago, but I pick up Stachybotrys, or I find some Stachybotrys, I know that something else is going on in that property, and it's been going on for a long time. And I would be doing them a disservice if we don't try to track down what that long-term event was. Now, often it's just chronic high humidity. That's a big cause of a lot of issues. People just don't seem to dehumidify. And again, in the southern half, often the air conditioning systems aren't sized properly, so they'll cool the place down before it gets a chance to dry itself out. And that's a recipe for mold growth. So there's a lot of things that can contribute to that, but chronic high humidity is a big one, which is why you see mold in a bathroom. And, again, one of the other things, it's a little out of sequence, but when we were talking about mold in an attic, in this area at least, and I'm not sure if it's the same all over the country, but a lot of people have pull-down stairways to get up into their attic, and they're typically located in a hallway, and that hallway is typically out, pretty close to a bathroom.
Sure.
So So somebody gets out of the shower. Let's assume you have an exhaust fan. Not everybody does. Assuming there's an exhaust fan in the bathroom. They shut it off and leave the door open as soon as they leave. All that moisture is going to get sucked right up through where that stairway is because they're not sealed. It's on top of it on the attic side that keeps a tight air seal. But sometimes they were called blankets. There's a number of different ways of doing that. But the normal thing for a shower is when you take a shower, the door should be closed, the fan should be on, the fan should stay on for about 10 minutes with the door closed after you've vacated. To get rid of, that's what it takes to get rid of that moisture. But when you open that and release it, now you're dumping that moisture into the house.
And it'll go where the air in the house is pushing, like you said.
Correct.
Into the crawl space, up in the attic, down in the crawl space, or it's going to push somewhere, and then that area.
It's typically going to go up.
It's going to go up and push. If the air is pushing, it's going to go, or just moisture, like, because you said the cold comes, pushes the hot air rises, right?
Right.
Cold air falls, and so the moisture is going to go with the hot air up into the attic and create the mold. And we're not looking, so we don't really know. We're just experiencing the spores, which can really harm our immune system. Like, seriously.
One of the other things that is typical is often we'll see bathroom vents vented into the attic space itself.
Oh my gosh.
It should always go up through the roof, or we see multiple vents connected to each other, and then they go up. So what happens is when one vent's running and the other isn't, you're actually pulling air from one bathroom to the other bathroom, as opposed to getting rid of it.
I interviewed a woman in the last few months who's a health coach who is in Florida, and they had to have their home, the mold remediated. And it was a major ordeal. Apparently it's only in the bathroom, right? So they have to seal off the whole house, and they said, okay, we'll work on it in the bathroom, but it's totally sealed off while we're spraying. You guys just hang out in the living room. So she's hanging out in the living room with her kids, young kids, and it definitely affected her health, living in a home with mold. And as she's sitting there and they're doing all this work on the bathroom, she starts smelling the chemicals, and she's like, well, what's going on? And she comes in and says, hey, I thought you guys sealed this off. Like, is it okay for us to be inhaling this? And we're now inhaling the mold because they're doing construction to remove it. Turns out the vented area, how the house was built, the venting for the bathroom went into the living room. I mean, it was just like the most ridiculous thing. So now they're sitting there, and the company, the first company she hired was just a complete joke, ended up causing them to be exposed to more mold and the chemicals, which were not safe chemicals. So they breathed them in, and they're starting to feel sick, and they're going, what's going on? So they ended up having to get another company to come in, and they found they had to do construction and make proper venting for the bathroom, and it was just this whole ordeal. But that the first company was so irresponsible with their health. It's just amazing that, and amazing that a house would be built in Florida where the bathroom would vent into the living room, is just beyond me. It's like we really do need to, just like we have to advocate for our own health, we really need to advocate for ourselves and look into how our home is built, whether we're either renting or we own it. We need to know, like, is there, what's the ventilation system like? Have we had our ducts cleaned properly? Do we have mold? Let's test for it. Let's test for the radon. Let's look at the insulation, make sure it cured properly. Let's test the VOCs, make sure we're not being exposed to, particulates and off-gassing that's harming us. Like, we need to take our home environment into our own hands. I love that you'd mentioned that when a family cooks a turkey in the oven, that the pollution inside the home is like being in New Delhi, like breathing in the air in New Delhi. And we're sitting here thinking that, oh, I live in such a wonderful neighborhood where the air quality is so clean. Like, here I am living in Washington State, where it rains so often that we always feel like the air is really clean here, but not inside the house, because these newer homes, just like you said, these newer homes are designed not to, they're designed to be energy efficient. So the more energy efficient a home is, the more it becomes like a balloon where the air is trapped inside. and it gets to trap all of these VOCs, all these particulates, all the mold. It traps everything inside, and so our home air can become toxic over time. I had a woman on the show who said that she had this machine that would is like a little box, and she'd leave it in a home for 24 hours. I'm sure you've probably heard of them. And then it captures all the VOCs, and then she tests it. And she said that she could tell you what brand of cleaners you have in your home, down to there's these one like Mr. Clean wipes, because of the specific carcinogenic chemicals that she would see on this list that was captured from the air quality in the home. Because she said everything under your sink off gases, all your cosmetics off gas, and we think that we're safe because they're in like a metal container. Like if it's a spray, like Lysol or something, well, it's in a metal container. What do you mean? Or if it's in a plastic container, we're safe. It's in a plastic container. But all these things off gas even through their containers and pollute over time the air we breathe. So we have to look at every single thing and create a home environment that supports our immune system, that supports our overall health. Just like you said with the Lyme patients, they were responding to their treatments after the mold was remediated, or they weren't responding to their treatments because they all had mold. I mean, that is right there a big wake-up call for people who are listening to the show going, I've tried everything. I don't know why I'm still sick. Just like me with catching every cold when I know I eat really healthy. It was because my home environment was destroying my immune system.
I'll tell you an amusing story. I got called into a job where somebody went in, did some mold testing, came back negative. The guy didn't believe him. So I went down to take a look at the property. And the house was pretty clean. There did have a little bit of an odor to it. And the wife had been horribly sick. She swore up and down that they had tons of mold. And I go down in the basement, and there's a 6x3 shelving rack, 6 foot high, 3 feet wide. And it is, I don't know, 5 or 6 shelves. Every one of the shelves was stocked with Lysol floral scent, something or other. And I said, what is all this for? He said, oh, my wife sprays it every day everywhere because she thinks she's got mold. Well, what she was doing was contaminating the environment, because there's a lot of chemicals in propellants, number one, depending on what they're using, could be bad for you. Who knows what other additives? I mean, the active ingredients they have to list, but you don't know what else is in there. But she was using so much of it. That's what was making her sick. And after she stopped using it, within a week or two, she felt fine.
Oh my gosh. Oh, she thought she had a mold problem, and she was causing her health problems with the Lysol.
Yep. I mean, it's too much of a good thing. Just doesn't work.
We have to be really careful with those chemical cleaners, and also really careful with those things that, kills 99.9% of germs. It's like we do actually need, like you said, there are beneficial bacteria in our environment. And we don't want to live in a sterile environment. We need to have the good bacteria, the good microbiome. I know everyone's for the last 18 years has been talking about the microbiome of the gut. Eat yogurt because it's good for your gut, or eat fermented food because it's good for your gut. And now, in the last few years, now everyone's raving about that there's a microbiome on our skin and on every surface of our body, and in so many more areas of our body than we knew, and it's beneficial bacteria. And so our home, which I find fascinating, also has beneficial bacteria. Tell us a bit about this device that you guys created to spread beneficial bacteria into the home. Why did you guys create it, and what are the positive results of it?
Actually, we can't take credit for creating it. Environmental probiotics have been around for a while. There's several companies in Europe that have been onto this technology for quite some time. But the idea was the device is designed to spray every 30 minutes for like 20 seconds, a burst of, essentially, it's fermented bacillus. And what that does is it's very unfriendly to the bacteria we don't want, and much more friendly to the bacteria you do want. So the way that it works essentially is a lot of bacteria is transferred on skin cells. We all shed thousands and thousands of skin cells every day, and the if you ever used a facial scrub, part of that uses a keratinase, which is a particular enzyme that's formed when bacillus is fermented. And keratinase is present in our nails, our skin, animal hooves, horns, things like that. But the keratinase sort of softens up that piece so that it's not conducive for bad bacteria, we'll say, to attach to. And it also it's slightly acidic, which makes it much more unfriendly to bad bacteria while encouraging the growth of good bacteria. So it's sort of like, probiotic. People take probiotics as a supplement. If you're taking antibiotics, they typically tell you to take a probiotic so that you can keep that balance going, because the antibiotics are non-selective in what they're getting rid of. So the idea is just to sort of fill an environment with bacteria that's not harmful. Bacillus is the same bacteria that if you were a kid playing in the dirt, that's what you would get that on you, which is one of the other issues I have too. If little kids nowadays would spend more time outside and eat a little dirt once in a while, they'd be a lot healthier as when they grow up. But they're just not exposed to it certainly like I was, or people of my generation anyway. Mm-hmm. And so this is sort of supplementing that. So it's not an air purifier, it doesn't filter anything out. The idea is just to get a healthier biome. Results on that have been pretty good. I mean, I have one in my bedroom. I don't really notice much of a difference, but I also have a 70-pound dog that sleeps between my wife and I. Wonderful birth control, by the way. And we don't seem to have, I haven't had any issues. So I'm guessing it's helping. But a lot of the people that we've put it in, especially the ones that have had serious mold illnesses, swear by it. And it's the pricing on the units has come down. It's not as expensive as it used to be, but it's an interesting concept. But it's not a replacement because it doesn't get rid of any particulates. It's not a replacement for a good air filter.
Yeah, it's just designed to support the microbiome of the home and discourage bad bacteria, encourage good bacteria. Can you share any of the anecdotal testimonials from using that?
Yeah, but I will. If one thing I did fail to mention, one thing that it does do, and there's peer-reviewed literature on this, there's two particular enzymes on dust mite matter that are very strong allergen triggers. Mm-hmm. And the bacillus neutralizes those two enzymes. So dust mite matter is a huge allergen trigger. Well, it's a little bit different now because mattresses aren't quite made the same, but years ago, your mattress could gain half of its weight again after 10 years. And that was all because of bugs, so to speak, mm-hmm. From dust mites. So that's a very, very strong environmental trigger. And it definitely negates that, along with helping crowd out bad bacteria and provide a healthier biome. So we had one woman who she's here in Connecticut. She had very severe mold illnesses. We went through the whole situation. We treated her house. We put in these better air units, and she was feeling pretty good. And then she would leave and go visit, I don't know if it was her son or her daughter or somewhere, and say that she just didn't feel well. So the second time she took the machine with her, it's only half the size of half a loaf of bread, maybe. She took the machine with her and she was fine. So is it in her head, or did it really make that much of a difference? I can't answer that, but it seems to work very well for her. The people who have them like them because they have to replace a cartridge in it every 3 months. So we certainly would know if they stopped replacing cartridges. And they love them. There's some units that can go into an HVAC system and treat the whole house as opposed to the room unit, but they're considerably more expensive.
So my son is allergic to dust mites, and it causes him to have asthma. And we, again, eat super clean. He doesn't eat any processed foods, no sugar. Like we eat so clean. So when he was getting asthma, I'm like, what's going on? He has, he doesn't have nutrient deficiencies. He eats super healthy. He gets outside. He's, everything, all his health is perfect. And then all of a sudden he was just getting this asthma. And we did all these tests, allergy tests, and we figured out he was allergic to about, or sensitive to about 5 different foods that would increase his histamine. But that dust mites was through the roof. Like he was really, really allergic to dust mites. So of course we're vacuuming like crazy, and we have the special dust mite covers on the mattresses, and we're washing everything really often. And I even saw this really cool study where they're able to kill most of the dust mites. It was something like 96.7%, something like that, with washing and soaking the linens and the blankets and the pillows in with Epsom or with eucalyptus oil. And so we're just going like gangbusters, washing everything with eucalyptus oil like crazy. And so he doesn't have his asthma right now, but if he goes to a friend's house and he plays in their playroom on the floor for a half an hour, he comes home and has an asthma attack. And so we really notice that when he is at other people's homes, and they might not vacuum as diligently as we do, he'll have asthma attacks from being around mold, being around dust mites for even like a half an hour. So we're looking for anything we can do to mitigate dust mites. And what you're saying is that this device that you have that releases the healthy bacteria, healthy microbiome into the bedroom, that it somehow neutralizes dust mites?
Well, it neutralizes the 2 allergenic triggers that dust mites have. The reaction that you have to dust mites is as an allergen, and that allergen is caused by, I think it's an F1 and F2, I don't recall off the top of my head, enzyme, that it totally neutralizes that, and so that you shouldn't have that allergen. Now, you could also use that in a spray, a personal spray, and spray some of it on his clothes before he goes to play somewhere, and see if it makes a difference for him. I don't know if it would or not, to be honest with you, but it might.
Or bring the small box, because you said it. I mean, it's very reasonable. I could travel with it to a friend's home and plug it in in their playroom. Does it act that fast, or does it take time?
It takes a while. Yeah, it takes a little bit of time to build up. When we install these, typically what we'll do is we'll actually spray, just like we would for mold. We'll spray all the surfaces with sort of a boost to give it a head start, and then it starts working from day one. But otherwise, it can take a week or 2 before it builds up enough where you would notice a difference.
Interesting. And what about the enzyme that Steve brought to you that breaks down mold? Does that enzyme also, and of course he was using it to break down the oil in the soil. Do these enzymes also destroy dust mites or kill them? Do you have any experience with that?
No. And again, we'd have to be very careful, because when you start to make claims, kill claims, your product has to be registered for that purpose. So these enzymes are different than the ones that were digesting oil. That the concept was the same, but the enzymes are much different. But even if it did, I couldn't say it does because the registration, it is not one of the intended uses when we register the product. So we've never actually done that same rigorous amount of testing on bugs as we did with bacteria and molds. We did come up with something for bed bugs that we developed that was would have been what's called a 25B exempt pesticide. 25Bs, you're very limited in what you could use for ingredients. There's a very select list, but if you stay within that list, it doesn't require a federal registration, although typically it does in the states. And because that's what we were trying to do, is get something really, really safe that could help with bed bugs. And it worked terrific, but the problem was it didn't have any walkover kill. So in other words, if I sprayed bed bugs, it would kill them. If I sprayed a surface and a bed bug walked over it, the kill rates were very low. So we didn't want to, we just decided to forget about it at the time. It was too difficult.
Got it.
But that's the difference. So there's something, I mean, most soaps will work because if you spray something with a soap, you're going to suffocate it essentially. Or in the case of like with ants, for example, the way that ant circulatory system works, there's no actual vein system, but it sort of breaks the bond and literally their guts leak out. But a soap could do that because it's a surfactant. It's slipperier than water. And so by increasing that or decreasing the surface tension, it can kill a bug. So that's why, I mean, soaps people use them on plants for small bugs all the time. They're pretty harmless.
Right, and that's a natural way to go about it. And we don't want to walk around using
so now whether or not that would work with dust mites, I don't know. But again, it would have to be a direct contact. That's the difference.
Got it. Okay. I just love it. Now, what about cat or dog urine? The smell, I've heard of people using sprays that have enzymes that break it down. Does Green Home Solutions have a solution for helping to break down that smell of cat urine?
Yes, cat urine and tobacco are the two worst odors to try and get rid of. Green Home's odor technique incorporates a product that I make that is a actual odor neutralizer. So most of the things you have, air fresheners, things like that, mess with the receptors in your nose. So it's not that the odor necessarily went away, it's just you can't smell it anymore. Either that or it substitutes a different fragrance for the fragrance that existed. Right. A lot of times they use a molecule called cyclodextrin, which is sort of like a seashell shape. And they'll typically have a lot of solvents in the product because you got to break it up into small pieces, and it gets trapped in that molecule, and that molecule will be coated with a masking agent. So again, the odor's still there. You just can't tell because it's being masked, and it tricks the odor in your nose. Neutralization, we actually change the physical characteristic of the odor molecule so it no longer has an odor. Most malodors have a charge to it, and the product has the opposite charge, then it becomes neutral. And once it's neutral, it has no odor. So it works really well. Dog urine is not a problem. Dogs are fine. Cat urine, though, cat urine is made up of several different things. Initially, when the urine is fresh, it's a bacterial odor. So at that point, anything that's antibacterial would actually get rid of the odor, because you kill the bacteria, you get rid of the odor, but it has to be relatively fresh. But when you go into a home that's had cats for a long time and it's old, eventually the urine will form uric acid crystals, and uric acid crystals are not water soluble. It takes about 15,000 grams of water to break down 1 gram of uric acid. So that's where the enzymes come in. But when you do add that water, it actually releases more of the odor. So every time you try to clean it with something that's water-based, it seems like it's getting stronger. So enzymes will break down that particular odor, but you got to be able to get to the source. And that's sometimes tough because it soaks into things quite deeply. So we have a procedure that takes a number of steps. It's a little bit time consuming, but it's been proven to work. We do use a little bit of hydrogen peroxide. And depending on the situation, I mean, if there's carpeting, the carpet's going to have to go. And unless you want to keep cleaning the same spot over and over and over again, which would be somewhat labor intensive and too expensive, it really has to go. Because then you can get to see if it got into the subfloor. And a lot of times on a real estate job, that we do a lot of work with realtors when the houses are changing hands, and the owner will say, well, my cat only went in this one room. And then you pull out a black light and you see these orange greenish splotches, yellowish greenish splotches everywhere. That's where all the cat pee is. And if they're male cats, they typically, if they sprayed, then you're talking about going up about 2 feet on the drywall. And that typically, source removal is the best thing you can do. We can neutralize it once we can get the source out. If it's on concrete in a basement, for example, often we can get rid of it, but then we have to seal it because you're not going to necessarily get down far enough into that concrete. Concrete's very porous to be able to pull everything out. But there is a process for it. Tobacco is the same thing. If you were in a room and somebody smoked in the room, we could spray that room, it'd go away instantly. But if somebody's been smoking for 20 years, there's what we call third-hand smoke, which is everything that builds up on the walls. There's 4,000 different chemical compounds in tobacco smoke.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with neutralization technology is the chemistry is different depending on what you're trying to neutralize. So we came up with a formula that works on most everything, but there's no way I'm going to cover 4,000 different chemicals. But so if the smoke is new, it's fine. There's a study done at one of the universities, and the name escapes me, but they had people smoking in a room for 4 hours. They measured the gas level. They went back in 10 hours later and measured the gas level. And then they went back in 10 hours after that, which was 24 hours later, and measured the gas levels. The gas levels were highest at the 24-hour period. So that was because everything that got onto the walls was giving back. So in a tobacco remediation, those walls, ceiling, floors, all have to be physically cleaned first. Got to get rid of that source. Again, if I just sprayed it, I would neutralize what's on the surface, but eventually whatever is buried in the paper is going to emanate back out.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to clean that all off first, then you treat it and it works fine. I mean, we've been very successful, but it's not as simple as we'd like. But it's really only those two odors that cause that issue.
It's amazing to think about, like, if someone buys a home from a smoker, they're being exposed to 4,000 chemicals that's off-gassing out of the walls.
Yes. They may not all be there, but they are going to be exposed to a significant amount. I mean, I've gone into homes where the person moved out and the walls, when we saw it before, the walls were yellow. And when all the pictures were gone, you could see that the walls were really white and the difference was dramatic. I mean, it looked like a ghost in there because that's how heavy it got built up.
Amazing. Well, I like talking about these different things your company does. I mean, obviously, removing cat urine is not going to be sort of life-changing to someone who has like health issues, but it is the reality of being a homeowner and also being a pet owner. And your company can save people a lot of headache and save them money by I like that your company tries to do it the smartest way instead of like, okay, we have to tear out everything. You're going to do it the smartest way and try to save the homeowner money.
Yeah, 90% of the work that we do for on those two in particular, cat urine and tobacco, are done because of a real estate transaction.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody wants to sell their house, they have an open house, people walk in the door, turn around, walk out, it smells like smoke.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Most of the time, the people that have the cats don't necessarily realize that there's an odor.
Yeah.
And maybe there isn't. I mean, a lot of times, I mean, I've got cats. I don't think my house smells. But typically it's if you're trying to sell your house or you're looking to buy a house that has that type of an issue, that's when we can really make a difference.
So a lot of real estate agents use your services.
Correct. For a number of reasons. Number one, we're pretty quick. We're really good at what we do. But because we can preserve most of the building materials, or certainly more than conventional remediation, the turnaround is much quicker. So often we can be in and out of a house in a day. Now, it really depends on the extent of it. In the Northeast, I'd say a good 75% of their real estate work is just attics because they all have problems. And then probably 15% is basements and 10% is somewhere else in the house. So for a realtor to be able to, our whole goal is to help them preserve their deal, not lose the sale.
Right.
And they're an excellent referral source for us.
Speaking of preserving, I know that your company also works with a lot of victims of floods. We've had some really crazy floods the last 2 years with, I'm just remembering Hurricane Harvey. I had friends in it and they, their house was so damaged. So just thinking about the floods we've had and are currently having now in the United States, um, tell me about how Green Home Solutions helps people who have just had a flood and to basically preserve their home.
Floods are different. And the reason they're different is the water, when you get rising water like that, you don't know where it came from. You don't know what it
Yeah.
traveled through. So it's considered category 3 water. Anytime you have category 3 water, anything that touches has to be physically removed unless it can be cleaned. So drywall has to go. I mean, we can clean drywall and preserve it. In a case of a flood, you can't, because you can't be 100% sure that there's not something in the middle of that drywall that could kill you. And we just can't take that risk. So it's the same, any kind of rising water, floodwaters are like that. Sideways rain is considered category 3 water. So if you get a tornado type thing where you get the wind whipping the rain around sideways, again, you don't know what that water could have gone through before it reached you. Normally, our work is done with either category 1 or 2, which is category 1 is potable water, and category 2 is, I don't want to say gray water, but it's water that, isn't perfect. You wouldn't want to drink it, but if you did, you weren't going to die. Category 3, you could die. So that has to be treated considerably different. And not all of our franchisees do water dryouts. A number of them do, especially the ones on the West Coast. And we do have a group in Houston that got started in Harvey. But that's, they preserve as much as they can, but you're going to lose a lot because you just can't, it's not worth the risk in those kind of situations.
And so Green Home Solutions would come in. Maybe could you just walk us through, let's say someone has just gone through a flood. Could you walk us through, like, what are the steps that Green Home Solution takes to ensure that that home is going to be safe to live in?
Well, first thing you're going to do is you're going to get rid of the water. That's going to get pumped out. You're going to dry everything as fast as you can, because you can dry it quick enough using commercial dehumidifiers, a lot of air movers. You at least limit any kind of mold growth. And then often, if there's a lot of debris left behind, mud and things like that, there's a piece of equipment that's almost like a carpet steam cleaner, but it's made for doing this type of work, to clean all those surfaces off and get them down to where there's no contaminants, no materials. And then you're going to have to test it, make sure there's no bacteria, make sure there's obviously mold growth.
Is that where you use the ATP
no,
device?
in this case, you would do that as a screen, but if it came back positive, you would definitely check and make sure it's bacteria. You'd want to know what was going on in there. Like I said, not a lot of our franchisees get involved in the heavy flood stuff. There's some decent water restoration companies. It takes a lot of equipment, and so the capital investment to be in that end of the business is substantial, and you also have to be on call 24 hours a day. Otherwise, nobody has a flood. Well, I shouldn't say nobody has a flood during the day, but most of the time somebody has a big water event at night, of course. And, not everybody who gets involved in the business wants to be a 24-hour-a-day business. They like their 9 to 5.
Sure. That makes sense.
So we don't do a lot of that, although except for most of the guys in California and ones in Texas do water restoration.
Got it. Okay, so let's say someone has done the water restoration side. Could they have Green Home Solutions come in and just test to make sure that there's no mold?
We actually work with some of the water restoration companies where they'll go in, they'll do the demo, whatever needs to be taken out, they'll get the place dry. Then we go in and we'll typically treat it, even if it's just preventative, and to make sure that there's not going to be any bacterial growth or mold growth. But it's after it's been dried out. So we let them do the heavy lifting, and then we go in and take care of the house like we normally would.
So the enzymes that you use to kill mold, it can also be used preventively?
Yeah, well, it can. Um, it's sort of an insurance policy, so it's really prophylactic to try and prevent growth by making sure there's nothing there that can grow. So if the house sits for a couple of days or something, and it's humid, we're hoping we're going to prevent that growth from occurring. Ideally, we would do it again once the house got when all the walls are up and the house is back conditioned. We do a lot of work with Habitat for Humanity now. We're one of their major sponsors, and in their situation, a lot of times when they build a home, it doesn't get occupied for, maybe 3 or 4 weeks. And it
Mm.
sits there and they tend to get, or they have the potential for mold growth. So for them, we go in and test. If it's not obvious, we can't say anything, we'll test it. We'll give them a clean bill of health so they feel comfortable turning the house over to their client as opposed.
Ah,
So it would be something similar to that.
okay. Well, I was curious whether the enzymes that you spray to kill the mold, if you spray an area, let's say a bathroom that doesn't have mold, but you sprayed it, do the enzymes stick around? And then if mold were to enter the area, kill it later on? Like, does it sort of have a half life or a shelf life or half life that it kills what enters the area for a certain period of time?
I get asked that question quite often, and to be honest, I don't know um, because we've never been able to get a scenario where we could actually test that. Now, that being said, if you go and treat an area, you're obviously it's going to kill anything that's there, so you're not going to have any mold. And if you did that on some sort of a reoccurring um, time frame, then you're never going to allow it to grow because you're going to get it. You can't, by the time you can see it, you've got a lot of it. So when you have a square inch of moldy wallboard, for example, that could be anywhere between 10,000 and a million spores.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't see it until it gets to it's already got its hyphae, which is the little fragments that are going to start to grow and into things. So spraying periodically would be helpful to keep it away. Now, can I tell you how long in between? No, I really don't know. We had a school that we did in West Virginia that was sitting in a floodplain. So they would get water under the building quite frequently, and there was a lot of mold growth under the building.
Mm.
Um, we treated the school. We actually broke through the foundation to treat in there one time. And then the idea was that we would come back. They would have the school tested every 3 months, I think it was. And we had figured that we'd probably have to come back about every 6 months and retreat it. They ended up closing the school. I mean, they kept it for that school year and then closed it. So we actually never did go back, but it did keep it away for, that was, I guess, 9 months or so.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I like that your whole philosophy as a company is to get to the root anyway. So you wouldn't, I mean, your philosophy isn't let's just spray all the time and keep coming back and spraying. Let's try to prevent it. In the school's case, you couldn't prevent the reoccurrence of flooding.
Correct.
But most residential areas, your company looks for the root cause and makes sure that whether it's putting a dehumidifier in and making sure the bathroom is ventilating correctly, or the other steps you take, you're making sure that the home doesn't have sort of that perfect environment to create mold, and then you spray to kill it, but you're not necessarily coming back and spraying preventively because there would be no need if you got rid of the moisture problem.
Right.
Yeah.
If we can get the homeowner to address the moisture issue, or at least, or we'll do it, or they'll do it. Somebody's got to address the moisture. If we can do that, then we can get rid of, and we get rid of the mold that they have now. They should never need us again,
Yeah.
because without the moisture, you shouldn't have a mold issue. Now, in some places you can't, there's areas that you just can't avoid it, but there's a lot of things that can be done. I mean, when I look at a property, when I approach a client's property, I'll look at the outside of the building first, and I'm saying, okay, if I'm a raindrop, where am I going? Are the gutters that are going to take the water away from the foundation, or is it dumping it straight down along the foundation?
Mm.
Is the grading such so that water is going to drain towards the house or drain away from the house? They're all, because when you think about it, it's really pretty simple. There's only four places that water can come from. It's either going to come down from the top, it's going to come up from the bottom, it's going to be a pipe leak, or some sort of a leak, or it's going to be high humidity. So when you break it into those simple things and look at what you're dealing with, it's not that complicated. Now, sometimes you have buildings that have a convolution of factors. One in particular was a clubhouse for an over 55 housing community, and the exercise room, the pictures in the room started falling off the walls because they were so wet.
Oh my gosh.
This was in Maryland. And what happened here was a whole bunch of different things. So, for example, in Maryland, for some reason, they love their mulch and they mound everything up really high. In fact, a couple of trees were dying because they were drowning, because they were just holding so much moisture. So because they love their mulch, they had splash blocks, which is a gutter comes down, goes into a splash block to lead the water away from the building, turned around backwards because they didn't want it to wash the mulch away. So the water was just going back against the building. They had sprinkler heads that had a 360-degree spray pattern 6 inches away from the building, which had a brick facade, and brick is very porous. The rest of the building was vinyl sided, and there was no vapor barrier. So
oh my gosh.
In Maryland, that's not uncommon, because half the year the vapor barrier would be on the wrong side anyway, because you have to pretty much even heating and cooling. But the inside of that exercise room, which was kept cold, had vinyl wallpaper, which is a vapor barrier. So now vapor pressure is driving moisture in the humid summers into that room, and it's going from hot to cold, and it hits that cold paper, condenses the vinyl wallpaper, but it can't get out because it can't get through the vinyl. Vinyl is impervious. So it just collected in the wall. And it was all of those things together that caused this problem they had. So, that's why you can't just look at the obvious, and a good visual inspection is the best thing you can do. Your eyes and your nose are far better than any testing. Testing can confirm, but your eyes and your nose are really what you need. And that's why we have to train our people so well.
And I love that, because these tests are really expensive. And if someone just comes in and doesn't take the time to look at the outside of the house and look at what happens throughout the year, if they came in the winter, they might not think about the sprinkler system in the summer, for example. Or if they came during the dry season, they might not be thinking about the gutters of the property, or the gutters of the house. In Canada, we call them eaves troughs. So, but here in the States, you guys call them gutters. But basically, to see the water coming off of the roof, and where does it go, and what's the gradient of the landscape. And there's this one corner of our house where it kind of floods outside, and we have a pump underneath the house pumping water out. But that failed one year, and it didn't get in our house, but it was underneath our house. There was water. And just to think about, like, wow, that could be mold under our house, coming up, like you said, because we have in our bedroom, in our walk-in closet, we have basically a trap door with stairs going down into the crawl space underneath, which just is dirt. And that was flooded a few years ago until the pump was replaced. And so I haven't even been down there, but it's not a vapor barrier. So mold could be down there coming up in through potentially, right? So having the visual, looking around and seeing, well, where is it coming from? What's going on in this home, inside and outside, before you even spend thousands of dollars testing. Because then now, like you said, what to test. Your company really helps people save a lot of money. Whereas another company might want to come in and just start testing willy-nilly and racking up that bill.
Yeah, now basic mold testing is not that expensive. I mean, depending on how many samples you have to take, it could be $300 to $400 maybe.
Okay, that's
it's
reasonable.
when you start going into all those other types of tests. The VOC testing is a little bit pricey. The lab fees on that are pricey because you're using a $3,000 piece of equipment. but testing just for the sake of testing makes no sense. I mean, you really
Mm-hmm.
need to get an idea what's going on. So they, if they go up in an attic, they know how to check and make sure there's enough ventilation.
Yeah.
There's a very simple formula to use. They make sure that, or even that they have any ventilation. And again, in the Northeast, you get a lot of ice damming in the winter if your ventilation is improper or you don't have enough insulation in your attic. And that could
Mm.
be like a waterfall coming into the house. It's a very ugly situation, but they're not uncommon. And so it's those kind of things we look for. And we're not trying to. We certainly don't want to scare anybody. We try to put everybody at ease. And so look, it's not as bad as you think, and we'll take care of it. Don't worry about it.
Well, and we need to we need to advocate. We need to look into these things to make sure that our home environment is as important as our diet and exercise and reducing stress. Like that is really important. There's this hot yoga studio that went out of business or moved or something out of this building in Woodinville, which I live close to, and we watched them move into the building, start their business, and a few years later they moved out, and for weeks there was construction. So we went by just, out of curiosity, and I looked inside and I couldn't believe it. The construction workers all had masks on and they were removing the drywall and they were removing all the insulation. They had to gut the entire building that the hot yoga studio had been renting. They had to gut it. And as I looked in, the entire building was black. I mean, black mold. It was amazing. And the light bulb went off in my head. I'm like, oh my gosh, how many people do hot yoga and not realize that it is behind the walls, it's all black mold they're breathing in, and they're going into into a sanctuary where they think they're getting healthier, or like you said, into a gym. Someone thinks they're getting healthier in this room for an hour a day, and they're actually being exposed to toxins that are making their health worse.
There's that. There's also, I mean, how many times do you drive by a site where they're building a house and the lumber sits outside for a couple of weeks
Yeah, in the
and
rain.
gets in the
Yes.
rain? That's not uncommon. And lumber yards, typically a lot of their lumber is stored outdoors anyway. It's undercover, but it's outdoors. When we first started making our product, we did some testing to determine long-term efficacy. And we bought sheetrock and plywood off the shelf at Home Depot. And some of the samples we inoculated with molds and then treated. Some we inoculated, didn't treat. And then we had our controls, which we didn't do anything to. The control pieces, which were just the way it came from the store, under the same humid conditions that we created for this test, actually grew more mold than the stuff we put mold on.
Oh my
Because it
gosh.
came that way. And you've got to be aware of this kind of stuff. But I'll tell you one thing, though. The most satisfying thing that we can do from Green Home's perspective, and this is part of our culture, is go into a property, do an investigation, and tell them they don't need us.
Yeah.
It is the best feeling in the world to do that. And it's worth so much in goodwill. The industry itself doesn't have a good reputation. We really pride ourselves on that. And if you don't need us, we're going to tell you don't need us. Nobody in this company needs money bad enough that they would do work that wasn't necessary.
And then they've earned the trust of that customer. That customer is going to refer to them or maybe use them in the future. It's so good to develop a relationship with a company that we can trust. So that's why I love you guys, and I want my listeners to know about your services, because I want my listeners to live in healthy homes and have a healthy air quality, and to know the things that you've shared today. You've given us a lot of really great tips that we can all apply today to our living space, including like something as simple as have a dehumidifier, turn the fan on and in the bathroom and leave it on. Make sure that it vents out correctly outside of the home. These kind of things that we can test for. It's been wonderful having you on the show and having you share all this great information. Before we wrap up, there's one last thing that I wanted to ask. And would you like to explain a bit about Green Home Solutions franchise for those who maybe are listening? Maybe there's someone listening who has been looking for another career or wants to help people in some way and wants to stop being an employee and own their own business. Can you tell us a bit about the business side of it?
The business is actually pretty simple. It's really about establishing relationships. Most of our work comes from referrals. Initially, when a new franchisee gets started, we typically have them visit with their local real estate agents, go to some of the real estate sales meetings, make a presentation in front of them, start joining some networking groups, and just make sure that people know that you're there. We cannot create a demand for our service. It's sort of, I liken it to a funeral director. Funeral directors, you don't,
You don't go around murdering people?
no, but you want to make sure that everybody knows what you do, because when the time comes, you want them to come to you.
Yeah.
So it's really a lot of just building relationships. I don't know all that much on the franchise. I mean, I know the franchisees individually, because I work with them every day. I train them. I don't know as much about that side of the business as I do with the science and the actual work that we do. But it's we've had people from all walks of life. We've had numerous people that change careers. I mean, we had one recently that, well, actually, it's not so recent anymore. It's been a couple of years, I guess. He was a high school music teacher, and he just saw that his days were numbered because the school budgets were getting lower and lower, and they were cutting out some of the arts and music programs. And he has a very successful franchise. Now, it takes a little while to get going, but it doesn't require a big capital investment. There is, obviously there's some franchise fees and there's equipment that you need to buy. But it's if somebody likes the work, it's not easy work. I mean, that much I have to say. It's not. There's some hard labor involved especially if you're working in attics and basements. But the thing is that I can emphasize the most is it's incredibly satisfying, because when you do this work for somebody, I mean, they wholeheartedly thank you, and you've got a friend for life.
I bet. You'd mentioned that, making connections with networking groups and real estate agents. And I would say you should add to the list, since you know all the franchisees, that they should really connect with health coaches, naturopathic physicians, chiropractors, like all the kinds of healthcare professionals in the holistic field that are aware that mold is a big problem. And that's exactly how I found out about you guys. So I love it.
Actually, that is one of our focuses now. We've been gearing more towards it. I do speak to doctors groups periodically, because if I can get them to listen and it all makes sense to them, they at least give us a shot, and all it takes is one patient of theirs feeling better, and it works out terrific. And they're good, they're great people to work with.
Yeah.
Some of the people that they have, patients are a little bit more needy, and you got to take your time. But it's a wonderful feeling when you see somebody who was absolutely miserable all of a sudden feeling better.
I bet it is. David, it's been so lovely having you on the show. Is there anything you'd like to share or say to wrap up today's interview? Was there any stories left unsaid, or any of your bullet points that you really wanted to cover?
No, I think we've covered probably more than I expected.
I know, right at the beginning, before we hit record, you're like, I don't know what we're going to talk about, And I was like, you just leave it to me.
I do want to thank you for providing the platform and for what you're doing for the same type of people that we are helping, which is absolutely tremendous. I was unaware of who you were until I believe it was after your meeting with Jeff, and started looking into it. And I'm just astounded at some of the guests you had. I mean, it's a treasure trove of good information for a healthy lifestyle.
Thank you so much. This is just like you are doing what you do, that you'll never want to retire because you love what you do. I love what I do, and I love learning from these guests like yourself, and also helping all my listeners. And my listeners love sharing these episodes with their friends and family, so we can spread this information and help as many people as possible to learn how to develop true health. That's where the name came from, Learn True Health. So we're all in this together. We're all becoming healthier and healthier together. David, it's been such a pleasure having you on the show. You are welcome back anytime you want to come and teach more. I love that you're constantly striving. You're a scientist and you're curious and you want to help people. So you're in a really good space where you can take that science and apply it to real life situations. And if you guys come up with anything new that's groundbreaking, that's really helping people, I'd love for you to come back and share it with us.
Thank you very much. And again, if your listeners have questions that are appropriate for what we discussed today, I'd be happy for you to share my contact information with them.
Great. I'll make sure I put it in the show notes of today's podcast at learntruehealth.com so that people can reach David Bloom, and also they can go to greenhomesolutions.com to check out more about the services and see if there's a local franchisee in their area that they could get in contact with. But I'll make sure that your email address is in the show notes as well.
Thank you very much, Ashley.
Thank you. Hello, true health seeker. Have you ever thought about becoming a health coach? Do you love learning about nutrition and how we can shift our lifestyle and our diet so that we can gain optimal health and happiness and longevity? Do you love helping your friends and family to solve their health problems and to figure out what they can do to eat healthier? Are you interested in becoming someone who can grow their own business, support people in their success? Do you love helping people? You might be the perfect candidate to become a health coach. I highly recommend checking out the Institute for Integrative Nutrition. I just spent the last year in their health coaching certification program, and it really blew me away. It was so amazing. I learned over 100 dietary theories. I learned all about nutrition, but from a standpoint of how we can help people to shift their life and shift their lifestyle to gain true holistic health. I definitely recommend you check them out. You can Google Institute for Integrative Nutrition or IIN and give them a call, or you can go to learntruehealth.com/coach and you can receive a free module of their training to check it out and see if it's something that you'd be interested in. Be sure to mention my name, Ashley James, and the Learn True Health podcast, because I made a deal with them that they will give you the best price possible. I highly recommend checking it out. It really changed my life to be in their program, and I'm such a big advocate that I wanted to spread this information. We need more health coaches. In fact, health coaching is the largest growing career right now in the health field. So many health coaches are getting in and helping people because you can work in chiropractic offices, doctors' offices, you can work in hospitals, you can work online through Skype and help people around the world. You can become an author, you can go into the school system and help your local schools shift their programs to help children be healthier. You can go into senior centers and help them to shift their diet and lifestyle to best support them in their success and their health goals. There's so many different available options for you when you become a certified health coach. So check out IIN, check out the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, mention my name, get the best deal. Give them a call and they'll give you lots of free information and help you to see if this is the right move for you. Classes are starting soon. The next round of classes are starting at the end of the month. So you're going to want to call them now and check it out. And if you know anyone in your life who would be an amazing coach, please tell them about it. Being a health coach is so rewarding and you get to help so many people.